Okay, I think we are ready to go. Dear friends, welcome to the closing plenary of what has so far proved to be a deeply enriching and exhilarating conference. I am Peniel Rajkumar, and I coordinate the WCC's work on interreligious dialogue and cooperation at the WCC, and I am also a member of the faculty at the Bose Ecumenical Institute. This closing plenary will focus on the theme, Teaching World Christianity. The awakening within theological disciplines to the world-shaped nature of Christianity has prompted, among many things, a critical attention to what the Sri Lankan theologian Aloysius Pieris once termed as the unholy alliance between the missionary, the merchant, and the military. This alliance, in some ways, has a time-defying legacy, as we see the Christian gospel to be problematically mixed with cultures of guns and greed. Both as a field of study, as well as a movement beyond parochial understandings of Christianity, world Christianity as a discipline and a movement has helped us to understand that the demographic shifts within Christianity are not just about ecclesial landscapes, but are also about landscapes of the mind, so to speak. In its own robust and contextually rooted ways, world Christianity has helped many to come to terms with a world dimension of Christianity that means more than the Eurocentric versions of adding a few more saris on our pews, samosas on our plates, and steel drums to our music. It is a world vision that has as its epistemological premise the conviction to live more fully and faithfully into that kenotic life that seeks not to be conformed to the dominant logic of our world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Our panelists today will help us to rethink those historical sites and sanctuaries of theological knowledge, which have long provided immunity to all those who have reinforced and replicated its logic by looking at teaching world Christianity through three important lenses of global justice, decolonializing the curriculum, and the critique of whiteness. Like other plenaries, we will have an initial presentation from the panelists, followed by space for interaction between the presenters, as well as with the audience. So it is a joy for me that all these three panelists are also people I call friends, from whose generosity and brilliance I have been greatly enriched. So without much further delay, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor Raymundo Cesar Barretto is Associate Professor of World Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. An ordained Baptist minister, he earned a PhD degree in Religion and Society from Princeton and holds degrees from the Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in Brazil and McAfee School of Theology, Mercer University. He has also served as Director of Freedom and Justice at the Baptist World Alliance. He remains involved in ecumenical and interfaith work, contributing in different capacities with the American Baptist Churches USA, the Baptist World Alliance, and the National Council of Churches USA. Among his recent writing projects, he's writing a book on the Latin American contributions to ecumenical thought and praxis, and is co-editing the third volume of the series, World Christianity and Public Religion, World Christianity, Urbanization, and Identity. Professor Barretto will speak to us on world Christianity and the demands of global justice, ethical and pedagogical considerations. Over to you, Dr. Barretto.
Thank you, Peniel, for this very generous introduction. Thank you, World Council of Churches, for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference. I have been learning so much from every speaker and every conversation that we have had so far. And I'm pleased to be able to participate in this on this panel with two colleagues that I have high respect and admiration for. I look forward to our conversation after each presentation. It's impossible not to have some overlapping between what I'm going to say, maybe what others will say. When I hear the word decolonization, I will use a very close word to that, decoloniality. It's not the same, but we'll probably be navigating very close waters. And that's not a problem. I think that will only enrich the conversation. So we're tasked to focus on the teaching of world Christianity, which is one of the focuses of this conference. Because at least in the panels that I have participated, I have not seen as much of a definition of the field. I'm going to start there with an overview that is done from a perspective and with a goal. And the goal is to bring some of the history of this emerging field or approach or discourse on the study of Christianity worldwide, with some theoretical developments in Latin America, in particular, the recent, or I would say what has risen in the past couple of decades that we have called decolonial thought, and some of the complementary, I would say, emphasis on those two areas or fields. So what's world Christianity? World Christianity is an expression, a term that has been used since at least the mid-20th century and has been used in very different ways. Has been used in the context of the ecumenical movement, and has also become an expression used in the rise of what I call a movement in the latter part of the 20th century, and more recently also as the title, the name of a field or an approach to the study of Christianity worldwide. As a movement, the late Lamisana stated that world Christianity is the movement of Christianity as it takes form and shape in societies that previously were not Christian. Therefore, he continues, it's not one thing, but a variety of indigenous responses through more or less effective local idioms. This emphasis on indigeneity was intended as a corrective to Eurocentric definitions of Christianity. Western definitions of Christianity tended to dismiss African culture, religions, and traditions as non-Christian. The gospel was seen as a commodity that European missionaries transmitted to non-European, non-white peoples around the world, who, in order to become Christian, had to turn their backs on their indigenous values and ways of being. By emphasizing the principle of translatability and the indigeneity of Christianity, Sana and others not only rejected Western Christian claims of exclusive possession of Christianity, but also affirmed Christianity as a non-European religion, validating indigenous cultures and religions as fit to receive and interpret the gospel on their own terms. Sana's move to prioritize indigenous reception and interpretation of Christianity over against missionary transmission allowed African Christians to take the front seat in the process of evangelizing their fellow Africans. Instead of being a religion brought to a continent without religion, quote Marx, by Western missionaries, Christianity became an African religion, spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa through the agency of African Christians using their own symbols and cultures. Through this lens, world Christianity contributed to expand the Christian oikoumene by giving full citizenship to non-Western Christians who interpret Christianity in their own terms. Such a move didn't preclude the understanding of the role transnational links played in the development of world Christianity. It simply corrected an imbalance by elevating marginalized voices of Christians, particularly in the Global South. The demographic and cultural shifts taking place in world Christianity and their implications for Christian self-understanding around the world led to the questioning of the limits of existing methodological and theoretical tools for the study of Christianity worldwide. The study of world Christianity then became a theoretical quest, which was defined by Dale Irving as an emerging field that investigates and seeks to understand Christian communities, faith, and practice as they are found on 6 continents, expressed in diverse ecclesial traditions, and informed by the multitude of historical and cultural experiences in a world that, for good or ill, is rapidly globalizing. It's concerned with both the diversity of local and indigenous expressions of Christian life and faith throughout the world, and the variety of ways these interact with one another critically and constructively across time and space. It's particularly concerned with underrepresented and marginalized communities of faith, resulting in a greater degree of attention being paid to Asian, African, and Latin American experiences, the experience of marginalized communities with within the North Atlantic world, and the experiences of women throughout the world. So he said, this is a threefold conversation. As a field, world Christianity has its historical roots in the disciplines of mission, ecumenics, and world religions. It continues to pursue conversations across borders of culture, across borders of confession or communion, and across borders with other religious faiths. Despite its ambitious agenda, I am proposing here that world Christianity discourse has not gone far enough to break with what Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano called the colonial matrix of power. In its corrective move to affirm indigenous agency, it lost sight of tools to interpret and engage systemic and oppressive manifestations of power. It's my view that while the world Christianity discourse contribute to challenge and expand understandings of ecumenism, it can, on the other hand, learn from ecumenical developments, particularly in the past 50 years. If world Christianity is intended to continue the conversations that used to be in the domain of missions, ecumenics, and world religions, it needs to expand its agenda and enlarge its critical and analytical approach. while the first generation of world Christianity scholars meticulously made the case that Christianity can no longer be perceived or studied as a Western religion, that claim is not enough to erase the impact of 500 years of history. We cannot ignore the global impact of Western Christian colonial enterprise that the Western Christian colonial enterprise had on the world we live in. Consequently, it's not possible to study world Christianity without attention to matters such as coloniality, ontological whiteness, heteropatriarchy, racism, and so forth. While some people in some parts of the world may feel the impact of such social ills more intensely and directly than others, the whole world is impacted by them. It's important to keep asking who is still missing around the table? Who are the overlooked others that remain invisible and excluded from our studies in world Christianity? And which questions of justice continue to be neglected in overwhelmingly positive, sometimes triumphalist narratives in this field? So let me begin just to point to some of the issues that we have in front of us. One is the growth of poverty. Even in 2005, 15, 16 years ago, we heard people studying world Christianity like Felix Wilfred, drawing attention to the fact that the drastic demographic shift world Christianity is undergoing is not simply a shift from the West to the South, but a shift of Christianity from the rich and middle class to the poor. He reminded his readers that those with below $500 as annual income are the ones who will be, if not already, the most numerous Christian disciples in our world. While information like this appears from time to time in books and journal articles in world Christianity, very few world Christianity scholars that I know have cared to spend time engaging its implications and ethical demands for those studying world Christianity and for our students, since many of them will be in position of leadership in Christian institutions. There is the problem of unwanted migration and racism, police and gun violence, among others. So while studies about how migration and migrants are the new agents in the transformation of the faces of the churches in every region of the world, very few of us have addressed the drama of mass migration in the 21st century, including the death bolts, family separation, children in cages, or what my colleague Alfredo Gami called the politics of wasting bodies and unwanted migration. In the part of the world that I live, the Americas, we are seeing an epidemic of gun violence, which predominantly kills certain kinds of bodies. In the US, as of today, 18,500 lives have been lost to gun violence of all kinds only this year. In Mexico, Central America, and South America, the numbers of victims of gun violence are even higher. Young brown and black men are the preferred targets. The Rio de Janeiro police, one of the police that most violent police in the world, kills one person every 10 hours. On May 6, 2021, in a favela called Jacarezinho, a very lethal operation of the Rio de Janeiro police killed 29 people, most of them black and brown, young people, in a region that's impoverished and also filled with churches. So what to do with these challenges and realities? are they concerned that we should be addressing as scholars of world Christianity, as teachers in our classrooms? How do we do that? So first of all, we have to start from our own location. The variety of existing liberative theologies exemplify the need to start from our own analytical and critical reflections in the concrete soil of locally embodied experiences, using language born in particular struggles for life and justice. So I will use one example of a meeting that I attended just a month ago, virtually, but organized by several Brazilian ecumenical organizations to draw attention to the chaotic situation Brazil is experiencing today due to the terrible administration of the pandemic by the management of the pandemic by the Brazilian government, which has led to more than 470,000 deaths to date, and unfortunately many more to come. The event was called Brazilian Tragedy, a risk to our common home. And I was asked to moderate a panel. And the panel that I moderated had a speaker that was representing an Afro-Brazilian religion, Candomblé, and another speaker who was representing the indigenous people. And the talk of Benilda Brito, which is available in Portuguese for those who can understand Portuguese, on the site of the National Council of Churches in Brazil. She began by saying, "I am a survival of racism. Death has a color of preference in this country. The Brazilian tragedy began when the first African was brought here by force." And then she continued, "As a Black woman, the only time I feel I am in our common home is when I am in the traditional homes, the terreiro, the candomblé, or among indigenous communities, among those who respect our ancestrality. When we suffer racism, we have our identity denied. Racism dehumanizes us. Without our ancestors, we don't have an identity. Our people have a different logic, a circular one. In a circle, one cannot see the beginning or the end. Everyone belongs equally. Everyone is important. This is what our communities believe as equal rights. How to believe in a democracy in a country that denies the racial injustices committed against us, affirming the myth of racial democracy. If they deny that racism is real, then there is no need to fight for anti-racist policies. So she went much longer than this, just deconstructing even the notion that was on the title of that conference, organized with the best of the intentions, that Brazil was facing a tragedy right now, and that we should come together as a common home, a common house, to deal with that tragedy. So we had people from the Vatican, from the World Council of Churches participating in that conference. The idea was to understand that the localized problem was not only local, was a problem that had implications and consequences for all. But she began by deconstructing that and saying this problem is much older than it seems. The tragedy began 500 years ago. Like Benilda, the other participant, Ailton Krenak, an indigenous leader and thinker, began by acknowledging his ancestors. Then he raised the problem of the binary perspective on truth brought by the Christian colonizer and the problems it caused to his people. The tragedy also began long ago, he said, in order to affirm the Christian God, the only true God, all the indigenous deities had to be denied. the denial and objectification of the other and of the land resulted from the exclusivist logic at the root of the colonial enterprise. Enough of truth, he said. We need to debunk the hegemonic truth to make room for other truth. We must, I know that I got my time, I have to, I'll stop after this. We must move from universalism to a pluriverse where our narratives can coexist as part of the broader social biodiversity. Unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about the theoretical significance of this. I will just say this, that before there is violence, physical violence, there is an epistemological or epistemic violence, epistemicide, as Boaventura de Souza Santos names it, killing the other and the other ways of knowing and the other's knowledge, the other ways of naming the world, naming themselves, naming their faith. And it's important for us, if we have in world Christianity an emphasis on recovering lost voices, invisibilized narratives, overlooked perspectives, it's important that we don't neglect the terrible impact that this kind of epistemicide has had. And the response to that is not to forget 500 years of history, but is to delink from it, to disconnect from it, to dismantle it, to construct and to heal what Gloria Anzaldúa calls this open wound, this border that cuts across our souls and our bodies. It's necessary to face this wound and to work through what she calls spiritual activism for a healing that doesn't forget, but that keeps hoping for a better and more hopeful future. Fortunately, I have to stop here because other people want to speak.
Thank you, Professor Barretto, for your introduction to world Christianity, and also for lifting up for us both the scope and the significance of this study for a transformational way of doing theology that will be transformative in its praxis in countering the injustices. Now we will move, I hope that there'll be time for you to pick on something that you have omitted from your lecture during the questions. Now we move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dr. Emma Wildwood. Dr. Wildwood is a senior lecturer in African Christianity and African indigenous religions, and co-director of the Center for the Study of World Christianity at the University of Edinburgh. She's also the director of postgraduate studies and co-editor of the journal Studies in World Christianity. Before coming to Edinburgh, Dr. Wildwood was director of the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide, and also lecturer in World Christianities in the Faculty of Divinity of the University of Cambridge. She's also taught in Bunia, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Uganda for a number of years. Her most sustained ecumenical commitment, according to her, was being part of an interdenominational church comprising of Anglicans, Methodists, URC members, Baptists, along with Roman Catholics, Quakers, and Syrian Orthodox, which she describes as a very joyful part of her life. And among her most recent publications include The Mission of Apollo Kiwi-Bulaya, Religious Encounter and Social Change in the Great Lakes, and also Ecumenism and Independency in World Christianity, Historical Studies in honor of Brian Stanley, that she edited with Alexander Chow last year. Dr. Wildwood will be speaking to us today on teaching world Christianity and decolonizing the curriculum. Over to you, Dr. Wildwood.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to join the conference. I'm sorry I've had to miss one or two sessions, but I have learned so much, and I've actually changed my talk because of some of it's already been said, but particularly by Miguel de la Torre, Kwabena Asimojedu, and Philomena Mwara. So thank you to you, and also to Raymundo. I wish I could go and change it again, but I shall just try and kind of pick out and move on from points that Raymundo has already mentioned. I really like to see the audience, so what I'm going to do is use the chat function for some of my notes, because I know it can be helpful to kind of see the words as well as hear them. And I'm going to put them in the chat, and in that way you have control over how you read them as well, and perhaps it'll give us a bit of a dialogical feel to what I'm going to say. Dr. Rajkumar has very kindly explained something of my background, and I think it's important because really I'm speaking from all those places and all those experiences in a way that I'm not going to bore you with. But I think it's important to know at the moment that I am working for this in the Centre for the Study of World Christianity in the University of Edinburgh, and that my own experience of teaching and curriculum design, although it's been informed by all these contexts, I'm particularly thinking about that context at the moment, a rather old secular university in many ways, but in a school of divinity that still trains a small number of people for Christian ministry. And what I'd like to do today is just respond to a few questions, and here they come in the chat. So what is teaching world Christianity? At least in my view, you've got some ideas from Raymundo, and I don't think we disagree too much. How far ought it, or does it, respond to challenges in the Western academy? Because I think there's a kind of a tension there that can be very productive, but is nevertheless something to think through. And I'm particularly thinking of this kind of strapline that we're hearing a lot, decolonizing the curriculum, and I'm going to speak a little bit to that. Then to raise some of the concerns about world Christianity, and these will fit with what Raymundo has said, but then also how might world Christianity connect with ecumenical issues? I very much see that ecumenics have informed the development of world Christianity, but there do seem to be some distinctions, and I think, you know, this conference for me has been part of that kind of learning together process, and I valued it. But I'd like to know from those of you who are listening whether these concerns resonate more broadly, and if so, in what ways, and if not, where are the disconnects? What are the issues you're dealing with? So we may not have time for a kind of full discussion, and I'm struggling with the disembodiedness of all of this, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. But, you know, do please put them in the chat, because I'd be interested to know anyway. So what might be talking about when we talk about world Christianity, or teaching in world Christianity? I'm going to put in the chat a few things that I found important in a general approach to world Christianity. Oh, well, I thought I was going to put it in the chat, but second time round it's not working. Let me see. I think that's gone in, some of it. So I'm talking about this approach. What kind of things are the kind of bread and butter, the things that run through much of our teaching? So one is Christianity is varied and widespread across the globe, and that diversity is enriching, that this is a good thing, this is an interesting thing, this is something that is life-giving. Also, that Christianity is not a hermetically sealed entity, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to this audience. Christian peoples and movements interact with people from other religions, from other cultural traditions, with politics, with society, and so forth. So it's no good just examining Christianity as a kind of thing in itself. It's always more than that. And here is my here are my next few that are still not going in the chat. Sorry about this. I thought this was a good way to communicate, and it's proving problematic. Christians, another important thing that in world Christianity is Christians have used their religious tradition to oppress and to liberate. Our Christian faith has been used in hegemonic ways, but any attempts to making it a totalizing system keep being broken down. And here there's a real influence, I think, of liberation theologies in world Christianity that is important and not always explicit. We also recognise that human concerns can look very different when viewed from another person's perspective, and equally the way we know about the world, the epistemologies that Raymundo has already spoken about, and what we regard as spiritually important are also quite different. And we need to be aware of that and acknowledge it and understand it. It's not simply enough to tolerate difference or to analyse difference. We need to respect difference and empathise with those who are different to us. And for me, empathy is a methodology, that we need a method of deep empathy to understand what is going on before we attempt to suggest what ought to be. And often that's a tricky thing, and but a very important thing. And it's particularly important for those of us who are white, those of us who come from countries that have a long history of colonization, as does Britain, that I'm speaking from, that actually rushing in and trying to sort things out and say what ought to be is deeply problematic, and we need to listen and to learn and to understand why things are as they are before making judgments. So it's important to teach about diversity, but we also need to study global interconnectedness. And I think this is the other side of the coin from traditional ecumenics, which has often sought these broad connections in the midst of diversity, or tried to work out how to make those connections. World Christianity is often flourished in diversity, loved seeing these different parts of the globe and where Christianity is different and interesting and enriching. But actual fact, some of the peoples that we're engaged with are actually saying, well, it's important for me that I'm connected with different parts of the globe, and that is enriching and it's part of my Christian faith. And we need to be aware of that as well. And then, of course, a final point, I'm sure you can think of others, that studying and teaching is inadequate in and of itself. It may reinforce our biases. We need to consider who we're befriending or listening to, worshipping with, which causes we support, how we engage, all that kind of thing. Because if, as I'm doing, as teaching in a Western academy, one of the tricky things for me is constantly balancing the expectations of my employer, basically, and the university culture with the challenges of Christianity worldwide and the different forms of Christianity and expressions of Christianity that we see. So I don't think it's difficult to see how these points have an ecumenical connection. In the ways in which ecumenism is accepting of and delights in a richness and of diversity. And I see throughout the conference, we've seen this balance of the contextual with the connectional. And I like this Methodist term, I revive it. It avoids loaded terms of globalized or universal, or even that beautiful word Catholicity that Christophe Chalamet spoke about yesterday. Not because we shouldn't use those words, but connection is a helpful word because it provides a way of thinking about the wider relationships within Christianity and discussing how far they are hegemonic or imposed, or indeed generative of fellowship and mutual support. And so for some of us, connectivity has been a kind of a useful term. Now, the WCC has long had a tradition of supporting contextual initiatives that properly engage with the local and regional differences and which question the normative positions of some of them. And the WC supports these contexts precisely through its connectional structures and networks and commitment to the commonality of some Christian statements of faith. So there you can see how context and connection are kind of almost indivisible, or that they play different roles within the same group of people. Now, I think it's important to recognise that the development of the study of world Christianity was intended to educate the Western Academy about the vibrant and growing Christian movements outside the West and the theologies and spiritualities they had developed in response to different cultural and religious contexts. It's basically a corrective to Western discourses on religion. And it also provided answers to scholars who had assumed that Christianity was so tied up with colonial power that it would simply disappear along with the political independence of the mid-20th century. And in this corrective, there's always been a collaborative endeavour with scholars from the majority world. Raymundo mentioned Lamin Sanneh, a couple of high-profile scholars who taught in Edinburgh are Kwame Bediako, founder of the Akrofi Cristala Institute of Theology, Mission and Culture in Ghana, and Marcela Althaus-Reid, a feminist and queer liberation theologian from Argentina. And they very much informed the nature of the centre where I now work. But if we I don't want to spend too much time on the past, but to think about what's happened in the last few years when we've seen a recent return to public consciousness of issues of racial and cultural difference in the face of a growing nativist populism in the Americas and Europe. And I've been really interested to see in the chat some real deep concern about what's happening in Brazil at the moment. And thank you to those participants who've been sharing that. And it's generated a renewed concern to the necessity of decolonizing the curriculum in the university sector. That's my current context. Now, decolonizing the curriculum actually has quite a long legacy, and world Christianity teaching is part of that legacy. So in the 1960s to 1980s, decolonizing was part of a movement to ensure that knowledge and practices of people outside the West were represented in higher education. It was influenced by curricular reform around the world and an awareness of multiple shifting epistemologies. It pushed back against some of the universalizing discourses of theology, and it studied how Christian practices, as it came into that area, and theologies have contextualized by engaging positively with indigenous ways of being. And to go to the WCC again, I think we can, just to name one thing, the support for EATWAT, the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians that Sister Mary John talked about from the 1970s, was kind of one such move to bring theologies from across the globe into the public consciousness, to publish articles, to bring theologians from the global south together to discuss these things, and to present them a platform to the Western world. And, it has really made people think about, we talk about contextual theologies and then the recognition that all theology is contextual. In this kind of earlier decolonizing commitment, you do see within world Christianity some critique of it. And I know Raymundo's already written about this. Scholars like Bediako critiqued the tendency to consider colonization as the defining moment in the construction of African identity. For him, this detracted from the creativity of African thought and society. And he says, by using the colonialism, decolonialism as a lens from which to view history and theology, African agency has been reduced. The pervasiveness of African epistemologies have been overlooked, and other asymmetries of power, ethnic, gendered, intergenerational, could be minimalised. And I think here, for me, Bediako points to the importance of historicising colonial processes, and I am a historian first and foremost, and seeing their variety. I still think that's important, even if we have a theological and ideological work to do. So as I say, Raymundo, I don't want to speak for him, but one of the things he seemed to be saying in this session and in the article in this book, actually, World Christianity Methods, I think it's in this one, isn't it, Raymundo, that some of you may be interested in. It's free access. He's showing that, says, well, colonialism runs through such a long period of Latin American history that it can't be ignored. And again, South Africans on the whole tend to take a different view from Bediako because of their history of colonialism, white settlement and apartheid. So these differences, I think, matter. They're not a sop to say, well, because somebody thinks differently, then we ignore the whole thing, but to actually have a granular approach to the way in which people understand colonialism. To come to more recent times, the decolonizing the curriculum debate, as many of you are aware, was reignited in 2015, largely in South Africa through the Roads Must Fall movement. And the discourse has been impacted by the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013. And really forced a greater attention to racial inequalities of power, and have shown up the politics behind curriculum privilege, behind the fact that there are many, many more white people teaching, and we've influenced curricula across the globe in colonies for some time. So I think there are some real challenges that are welcome, that academics need to ask: what do we know? How do we know it? What don't we know? And why don't we know it? Who's teaching and why? And this is for a white woman teaching on African Christianity and indigenous religions, this is a properly uncomfortable position to be in. And so I think this movement has encouraged a greater awareness of systems and cultures that are unequal, and an identification of who has less power and why, and how power dynamics work. And we need perspectives of people around the globe, because we mustn't assume that everyone experiences oppression and inequality in the same way. And I think that's really critical. Now, many of the concerns raised in my sorts of conversations in decolonizing the curriculum have actually already been incorporated into the way in which world Christianity has been taught. However, this is not a moment of self-congratulation. And here I agree with some of the issues that Raymundo has raised, and I'm just putting them in the chat there. We've yet to make a significant impact on theological and religious studies teaching. Inroads have been made, but there's more to do, and I'm kind of trying to seize this moment in my own university. Attention to the growth of the church in the global south has, as Raymundo's already said, sometimes been co-opted by Western Christians in a triumphalistic manner, or in that feel-good, well, the decline of the church in Europe looks pretty bad, but never mind. There are still Christians elsewhere, without kind of realizing how these things might be connected. Yeah, I think I am concerned about some of the rhetoric coming out in some ways in which world Christianity has been adopted, and in some institutions, I have to say. the cultural lens that I think we've most often used to frame world Christianity studies can relativize race and policy and locate it at a safe distance from the academy. And it does not fully articulate the injustices around race and poverty. I think Raymundo has already said this point. Who's doing the teaching? We do need diversity, more diversity in this one. And those of us who are white and influenced by a kind of colonial mindset from our earliest years need to attend to that. And I think we do need more work on issues connected with climate crisis. I kind of feel I constantly footnote this and never get much further with it, but it is the most crucial issue of our time. And it links to inequalities of power. It links to it links to coloniality and this kind of thing. And so there's more work to be done on that. So I'm conscious of time, although Peniel, if I've run over, just wave at me. I've just got a couple more things I'd like to say. Oh, yes, he's put it in the chat. 1 more minute to go. Okay. So I wanted just finally to say what how world Christianity might aid ecumenical thought, and I'm sure there's a two-way process here. So first of all, we need to ask in all things, is our teaching extractive? Does it actually benefit the people that we're engaged with? What about this cultural lens? Is it good enough if it's overlooking issues of race and poverty? How do we deal with a range of epistemologies? And I think that's a really crucial question when it comes to ecumenical dialogue. I think world Christianity can be useful because it's created a bridge between constructive theological studies and the larger secular academy. I think in world Christianities, we largely avoid questions of creedal rectitude. I liked Adair Matthias's focus on biodiversity. I think that's what we're doing, rather than the conflict of ecclesiologies, which some people have been working hard at. And I think judgments are made cautiously and reluctantly. And I think this is part of the problem why we perhaps haven't spoken out against issues of race and poverty, because we're still in this mode of listening, saying what is, being non-judgmental, and that's an issue for both kind of subject areas, how we deal with that. I do think world Christianity provides a way forward beyond the faith and order style approach, and I think that's very important if we want to move beyond polarization in discussing issues like prosperity teaching, human sexuality, and Trinity. All I ask now is to know from your teaching context whether this has been useful. I'll put a couple more things in the chat, but I hand over to Peniel and look forward to your responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for lifting up some of the key questions and issues that are intrinsic to the teaching of world Christianity and decolonizing the curriculum, and also for identifying very helpfully the convergences between teaching world Christianity and also the enterprise of ecumenism itself. Thank you again. Now we will move on to our third presenter, Dr. Eve Rebecca Parker. Dr. Eve Parker is an Anglican feminist theologian in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University in the UK. She works with the Common Awards team that is responsible for validating lay and ordained ministers in the Church of England, the United Reformed Church, the Baptist, and the Methodist churches. Dr. Parker has extensive ecumenical experiences. She has worked previously for the Council for World Mission, both in London and in Singapore, on the theological education programs, and also for the United Reformed Church on global and intercultural ministries. Among her most recent publications include the book, Theologizing with the Sacred Sex Workers in South India, which explores the lived religiosity of Devadasis in South India and relies on Dalit theological discourse. Dr. Parker's paper will focus on world Christianity as a critique of whiteness in theological education. Over to you, Dr. Parker.
Thank you so much, Peniel. Thank you so much to the two previous presenters. They were amazing papers, and I think I will no doubt pick up on many of the points that have been raised, but I don't think that's a bad thing. In many ways, it's just helpful, I suppose. I was recently a speaker at an online conference that was entitled Dismantling Whiteness. And it was hosted by Oxford University, and it focused on this notion of critical white theology. And there was a significant amount of Twitter backlash that myself and others received from those who were not actually in attendance at the conference, but were offended by this title of the conference, Dismantling Whiteness. And some of the comments included the following: self-hating whites are at it again, leftist woke racists, come try and dismantle me and you will be knocked the F out. You're going to hell for race hustling. Discussions on the topic of whiteness often lead to defensive, aggressive responses that expose the fragility of white identity politics and embodied racial prejudices. And theological education must not shy away from these topics or the rise of racism, the growth of interreligious intolerance, and the normalization of fascist politics that is on the rise in Europe. In the UK, we have a prime minister that has used vile racial slurs against Black people and has argued that the Islam has caused the Muslim world to be literally centuries behind the West. No matter what the context, this is not okay. This is a person leading a so-called powerful nation that says of the British Empire that the continent may be a blot, but it is not a blot upon our conscience. Further stating that the problem is not that we were once in charge, but that we are not in charge anymore. Adding, the best fate for Africa would be if the old colonial powers or the citizens scrambled once again in her direction on the understanding that this time we will not be asked to be made to feel guilty. Such statements from the British Prime Minister are exceptionally dangerous and relevant as we look to the study and teaching of world Christianity. As such, ideological racism and rhetoric from political leaders has enabled once again for the normalization of racism and xenophobia. And it is therefore a necessity to address such realities in our classrooms, in our curriculums, and in our pedagogies. As it's also the case that students of color have experienced racism in theological education institutes. My ongoing research with the Common Awards team in the UK that is responsible for validating ministerial formation through theological education for the vast majority of those who are going forward for ordination in the UK has found that Black and ethnic minority students experience isolation, marginalization, explicit racism, persistent feelings of unbelonging. Passive concern for racist oppression in our communities will therefore not be enough, as whiteness must be dismantled through participative struggles that requires educating on the realities of colonial Christianity and white imperial religiosity, because theological education has been complicit in the dehumanization of students of color. It has, for the most part, failed to acknowledge that white Christianity as organized religion supports the exploiter, as it has been used to justify wars, crusades, and slavery. The Christianity of white supremacy has subjugated continents. It has divided and oppressed land and people. In agreement with Herzog, behind Auschwitz and Hiroshima lurks the face of the white God, whose infinite power men sought to imitate in acts of infinite violence. The gospel, though, as we know, has been embraced around the world in a multitude of languages, contexts, and cultures. There has been a significant shift from the West to the South. And as Raymundo highlighted before, And as Felix Wilfrid has pointed out, there has been this shift of Christianity from the rich and middle classes to the poor. Consequently, it's the case that Christianity can no longer be dominantly conceived from a Western perspective, and nor should the voices of the white middle classes control the narratives of Christian discourses. And yet in the UK, it remains the case that for the most part, Western perspectives dominate the academy. Particularly in the UK context, and also class divisions appear to be ingrained in the dominant structures of theological learning. Those with the powers in theological education have too often neglected the theological truths from the majority world. They have pigeonholed certain theologies, as we know, as contextual, and created this hierarchy of knowledge. And in doing so, they have failed to acknowledge that all theology is contextual. Despite studies in world Christianity around the world offering a means by which Christianity can be situated in colonial and post-colonial contexts and enable, therefore, for a greater understanding of the complexities of Christianity, power and identity, world Christianity is not a core module for those in training for ordination or ministerial formation in the UK. And this paper, or this presentation, I want to therefore address this issue. I want to talk about what James Baldwin refers to as the white problem in dominant discourses of Christian theological education, as whiteness is a metaphor for power. Whiteness has privileged white, male, middle class, heteronormative theological truth claims over and against that of Black, womanist, majorista, queer, Dalit, and other liberationist truth claims. Epistemologies. I will suggest that world Christianity can offer a critique of whiteness in theological education and should therefore be required as a core module for those in formational training for ordination. Noting that there is a need to confront Christianity's history of colonialism, conquest, empire, racism, and domination as a means of challenging the theological truth claims that have enabled those of us in the West to construct a world where whiteness dominates and where Christ is white. I will argue that teaching world Christianity enables students to reinterpret the impact of whiteness in different places and periods of history, including the present day, by highlighting the role of empire in situating the colonial impact of whiteness. I'll note the ways in which knowledge has been racialized and the extent to which whiteness equates to power as a consequence of the lasting impact of empire and colonialism. Because, as George Rigueur notes, empire affects everything, not just politics or economics, but also culture, intellectual life, emotional sensitivities, personal relationships, and even our image of the sacred. Now, Raymundo and Emma have both already highlighted this, but just to quickly cover again this notion that the discipline of world Christianity is an acknowledgement that the local affects the global, and a reminder of humanity's interconnectedness. As a field of study, it is interdisciplinary and intercontextual, in that it situates itself in the context of people's lived religiosities and takes seriously knowledge produced in and by communities and people from around the world. The study of lived Christianity around the world therefore enables the indigenous and marginalized communities to speak theological truths to discourses of power, thereby producing new possibilities of knowing and constructing the world in ways that go beyond Western rationality. So what can world Christianity then offer to those in theological training for ministerial formation in light of the oppression of Black people and class struggles? In agreement with Miguel de la Torre, for white privilege to be maintained, white ignorance must be sustained. As whiteness is about a false claim on innocence that depends on the demonization of Blackness. So educating in resistance of such ignorance therefore enables a path toward liberation, as the study of world Christianity offers a critical means by which the non-Western Christian theologies and religiosities can help to decolonize Christianity. In doing so, the hierarchies of knowledge systems apparent within Christianity in Christian theology can become exposed, as the study of world Christianity also enables for the reclaiming and recentering of indigenous epistemologies. It offers a potential means of encouraging students to engage with the complexities of the histories of Christian mission and its entanglement with colonialism and slavery, which further calls for a decolonial engagement with Christianity, whereas Barretto and Servant have noted there is an option for epistemic disobedience, the delinking from the hegemonic Western foundations of knowledge. And such an engagement with world Christianity will be necessary in order to address the systemic legacy of colonialism and its impact on Christianity, noting that racism is in itself a propagation of whiteness that is a consequence of Eurocentric knowledge reinforced through what Raymundo highlighted as this matrix of power. In agreement with Mignolo, the task of decolonial thinking is the unveiling of these epistemic silences of Western epistemology and affirming these epistemic rights of the racially devalued as a means of allowing the silenced to build arguments to confront the dominant powers and sources of knowledge that have in every way devalued and dehumanized the colonialized, noting that Eurocentric epistemology not only justified racism, but also patriarchy, heteronormativity, and neoliberal capitalism. And it's for this reason that Anthony Reddy has questioned why it is that Christian theology has developed a penchant for observing in minute details many forms of theological abstraction, but has largely refused to observe the visceral and palpable nature of racism within the body politic of white majority societies and churches. And he further highlights that the embedded nature of whiteness has formed a world in which notions of manifest destiny and white exceptionalism have given rise to a toxic reality that is built on white supremacy. The challenge is therefore to tackle the systems and structures that strengthen and support whiteness, including academic and church structures, which have been complicit in the oppression of those who have had their rights and dignity and humanity denied. So in a world entrenched in the repercussions of empire, ministerial formation and theological education finds itself nestled in the realities of white supremacy, grave inequalities, racial prejudices, homophobia, and gender-based violence. And therefore, educating those in formational training with the tools and knowledge to resist such structures of oppression is in every sense a theological imperative, because the impact of Christianity on Black suffering cannot be denied, and nor can the systemic shaming of the bodies that challenge the colonial norms in regards to gender and sexuality. And therefore, whiteness in and through theological education must be dismantled. But to do so, theological education will have to become epistemologically disobedient to Eurocentric Christianity if it is to dismantle whiteness, because in agreement with Nyong'o Wathiongo, the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism is this cultural bomb. The effect of the cultural bomb, he says, is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacity, and ultimately in themselves. And this is why the study of world Christianity is so vital in ministerial formation, as it enables a conscious awakening to the truths of imperialism and the conglomerates of power. It offers the student with the opportunity to enter into dialogue with those who have been marginalized and oppressed by Eurocentric epistemologies. And through an engaged and intercultural dialoguing of learning, all aspects of life and religion, as we know it, can be transformed. Because the discipline of world Christianity enables for the questioning of the role and purpose of the Christian church today, its contemporary role and its missional history, and enables an encounter with the variety of Christianity that can challenge the toxic theology of white Christianity that, as Miguel de la Torre has remarked, is based on fear, not on love. So, to make this point, let me briefly draw on some of my own research in the field of world Christianity that focused on the theology of contemporary Devadasis in South India, otherwise referred to as Dalit sacred sex workers. Now, this was ethnographic research that focused on the lived religiosity of Dalit women in the South Indian village who'd been dedicated to the goddess Yelama in childhood, usually as a direct result of poverty and smallpox. And the lived religiosity of the Dalit sacred sex workers is one of religious hybridity It's one of indecent live religiosity. Many of the women I encountered had converted to Christianity, and yet they'd sustained their belief and worship in the local village goddesses. And their profound lived Christianity enables an encounter with subaltern religiosity that centers on the goddess who responds to the people's needs at a given time and place, and was often worshipped alongside the Devi Jesus in the brothels of the sacred sex workers. And so the religious hybridity of the Dalit Devadasis initiates a religious identity that is shaped by the dedicated women's experiences of both the goddess and Christ, where they simultaneously hold beliefs in both and allow both Christ and the goddess to shape their meaning of life, thereby creating this blurred space of religious identity and borderless spirituality in their love of Jesus and their sustained belief in the ultimate powers of the goddess. The religious paradigm of the Dalit sacred sex workers also exposes the sexual lives of the oppressed, the role of the economy, the role of the caste system, patriarchy, both within society, religion, and theology. And it also presents an alternative to the closed monotheism of white Christian theology, where, as Reddy remarked, the Christian God is jealous and competitive God who will not tolerate rivals and the other, and worship such gods, which in turn conflates with white exceptionalism, privilege, and power. Instead, the hybrid goddess of the Dalit sacred sex workers enables us to challenge the monotheistic God of white Christianity that has been used to justify white supremacy. The study of such lived Christianity also forces us to engage with the colonial past, where the Christian imperialist notions of morality gravely impacted and transformed the role of the Devadasis. And it further enables this critical theological encounter with what Marcella Althaus-Reid refers to as the indecent lives of the oppressed, where God is contemplated in the brothels and questions are asked about the role of the church in discussions on sex workers. Problems, of course, arise when the church insists on an exclusive religious belonging that refuses to acknowledge or incorporate the religious identity of such subaltern communities. As one Devadasi described, I'm told to accept Christ, but Christ does not accept me. The church will not let me and my children be baptized. I am not welcome to come to church services. I am not welcome because I'm a prostitute. So the goddess Matama or Yelama will release her wrath because I've accepted Christ, and the church still does not welcome me because I'm a sex worker. So what hope is there for me? The study of world Christianity brings to the forefront such questioning and enables a profound insight into the history of Christian missions and the lasting impact on the lived religiosity of the indigenous Christian communities, where Christianity is lived as their own and decolonized in the process. In a previous role of mine that involved teaching theology to those in training for ordination in the Church of England, I introduced such lived narratives of Christianity into a module on missionary movements. And I did so as a means of conscious epistemic disobedience, used as an exemplification of what is possible when lived Christianity is liberated from whiteness, and as a means of outlining the colonial impact of Christianity in India. And this enabled an intercultural pedagogy that addressed the matrix of power, inclusive of capitalism, racism, casteism, sexism, and heteronormativity that is apparent in the social constructs of whiteness. Now, the focus was on developing a transformative pedagogy that would enable whiteness to be addressed in the classroom, of majority white ordinands preparing for ministry in majority white contexts. As to be clear, dismantling whiteness requires addressing a set of normative cultural practices that is visible most clearly to those it definitely excludes, and to those whom it does most violence. Those who are securely housed within its borders usually don't even examine it. And therefore, this required making visible what the majority in the room were invisible to, as the parameters of what it means to be Black and subsequently what it means to be white are marked out through this practice of differentiation. And the process of demarcation secures Blackness as a racial and ethnic identity, while simultaneously it permits the mystique of whiteness as a deracialized, unthought out category to continue. And what we know is these same parameters have been applied to white Christianity, where these imposed norms have dominated and created an epistemic hegemony that has made possible to allow for white Christianity to ignore the theological truth claims and experiences of Christians from the majority world. So teaching on the subject of Dalit hermeneutics and Devadasi Christianity offered an opportunity to decenter the white dominant epistemic. And the students were able to engage theologically beyond the boundaries of the white norm in order to contemplate a subaltern Christianity, and in the process become obviously conscious of the fact that Christianity is not the white man's religion. The indigenous Christianity of the oppressed instead presented the students with a lived religion that resisted white oppression, colonial norms, and mission history. And Outhouse Reid refers to this as a process as theologically pedagogic, where focus of theological education is on the praxis of liberation for the oppressed, so that those in dialogue become conscious of the unjust and dehumanizing aspects of the systems of oppression that seek to transform the world. Thank you, Peniel. I'll just be one more minute. Central to such a transformative pedagogy in world Christianity is the dismantling of colonialism in order to free subjugated knowledges, histories, and live religiosities, and deliberately explore sites of oppression, dehumanization, and subjugation. And this requires of the student the need to learn to unlearn in order to relearn and rebuild. Because, for example, contemplating God in the brothels of the Devadasi in South India challenges the dominant structures of knowledge production, as knowledge instead stems from the indecent spaces inclusive of the sexual and religious narratives of the oppressed. So narrating the lived theology of the Devadasis also enables this decolonial expression of Christianity that situates the indigenous hybrid Christ at the center of theological contemplations in order to reimagine alternative ways of being in the world. Now, I want to end on a sad note, because I want to agree with Freire that we would have to be naive indeed in order to expect the elites to collaborate with us in their own destruction. And this is why we must be subversive if we are to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. In other words, if we are to dismantle whiteness in and through theological education, as it is not a simple task to dismantle whiteness in a majority white classroom, in a context in which the British Empire is looked back on with nostalgia and pride, and white Christianity is used to police such views and rely on white ignorance. And I will end there.
Thank you, Eve, for your presentation and for calling out how the knowledge regimes of today are carefully recalibrated to sustain the empire in our midst. What we'll do now is, as we thank the three presenters for their excellent presentations, open up the floor for questions. I request you to use the raise hand function so that we can ask questions in the order of those who have raised their hands. So please use the raise hand function and I'll call you to ask your questions. Ricardo, Ricardo, can you please ask a question?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Daniel, and thank you, Dr. Emma, Eve, and Raymundo for your presentation. Let me challenge us with a question. I agree with you three, and this is music to my ears. As a Latin American who spent 24 years in the US and did all my education at the bachelor level and master level in theological education in the US, I had to learn about Anglo and European theologians. I never got the chance in 10 years of going to school to study about any Latin American theologian out there. I had to do that in my own and constantly bring those theologians to the classroom and in my papers. I'm grateful because I'm taking a course, online course in ecumenical relations with Bossi Institute. And I just checked the out of 40 papers that are required or recommended to read, only one paper is from a Latin American author, Dr. Miguel de la Torre, who was a speaker here. So here we're preaching to the choir. What we have to do to really decolonize the curriculum and the theological reflection on ecumenical institutions like the WCC, BOSI, Princeton Seminary, and others. Yes, there are some African and Asian authors that I was pleased to read and discuss in BOSI, never in the US. What we can do to that, and I end with this. I'm also participating in a conference right now in the US, the Hispanic Theological Education, funded by Dr. Justo Gonzalez. There are 500 people, mostly Latinos in the US and Latinos from Latin America, discussing and attending this conference. Do you know how many Anglos and Europeans are part of this conference? 0, none. Because Anglo theologians and European theologians don't think they can learn something from Latino theologians. So I just put that in the table for discussion.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm now going to take Wandimo Sunesa's question too, and then turn to the panelists.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So my question is, in theological seminaries or schools, it's obvious that dismantling racism is now a hot issue being dealt with, especially here in America, and also from the presentation we see it's also in the UK and other parts of regions of the world. In one thing that I want to ask is, when the areas colonized and now decolonized are experiencing maybe the consequence of the time they experienced colonialism or racism in the form of religious hegemony, there are also other aspects of this, both in those countries which were colonized and even those which were not colonized. For example, I'm Ethiopian. In Ethiopia, we don't have really the problem with the colonizers religiously impacting our culture negatively, but we speak of ethnic supremacy in the form of religion. And this is between Africans and Africans, or in the same country, nations have a kind of royal family and others are marginalized. So is theological education, is it not the task of theological education to also consider what is internally happening between ethnic groups in the church and among the same group of people, not only the problem between white and black. We are 85 nations in Ethiopia, but only one language is nationally recognized. And but of course, people are using their own language. But when it comes to religious circle, it is very difficult, and you are considered as religious national and narrow nationalist.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wandimo, for your question. May I request the panelists to respond to these two comments? We will start with Eve and then move on to Raymundo and Emma, if that is okay.
I think my response might be quite brief, but it's just to say that because both questions relate to, for me, a fundamental issue, that I don't think theological education can be trusted unless it starts to really reflect on the fact that it is epistemologically flawed as it is, and therefore how can we honestly say that it's doing its job, as it were, because it is not being honest to the global truth claims. And so I think it comes to the root of the issue, is that it seems to be, in the papers that were presented yesterday, we had the same issue, that across the world the dominant voices are not reflective of the majority world, and this needs to be changed. And I think Emma mentioned before that there seems to be, I hate thrown around the term Kairos moment, but it is. There seems to be that case in the US and the UK right now to bring about real change, and I think we grasp it and take full advantage of it. And moments like this where we're all together give me great hope that we can actually do this together. But as I said, subversively from using the master's tools, because that's the way to do it.
Thank you, Eve. May I turn to Raymundo and Emma for your thoughts?
Yes. First, the question from Ricardo. I'm so sorry, Ricardo, that that was your experience. It was mine too. When I was doing my MDiv and even my doctoral program, and even now teaching at a school that has a history of connections with Latin America that goes back more than a century. When I got back to Princeton now to teach, I was the first Latinx faculty after 7 years of a gap, when nobody was teaching anything on Latin America or Latinx Christianity. And very few of my colleagues used any Latin American literature. Those who did tend to use the ones that are best known, but that don't represent the diversity and fluidity of the production. Things have changed a lot in my context, but since then, but it's not the reality in many places. I think it reflects what we're talking about. And that's why I didn't make the difference. I think Eve did. There is a difference between colonization and coloniality. I mentioned the coloniality of power. So colonization may be already gone in some places. The administration that controls political and economic power and so forth, but the structures of domination, including the epistemological structures and ontological structures, continue in place. And even when we are silent, and that's why, for example, I am raising some of the concerns about the field of world Christianity, because we can, I am fully with Eve. I don't believe that the master will change anything unless they are forced to. And it's very easy to see a disguise, something that appears like intercultural theology, like world Christianity, and becomes a very easy way out of shame, not necessarily a way of facing the problem. So I understand the plurality, the diversity that we have in this field, but it's important to take into account all narratives, which of course cannot be universalized. Orlando Espin makes a distinction between universally valid and universally relevant truth. The more hegemonic approach tends to affirm the validity of their perspectives as universal. But every perspective has, I would say, potential to be relevant elsewhere. And what I believe that the colonial thought from Latin America and the Latinx scholars offer is this opportunity to engage more constructively with the idea that the matrix of power that was put in place during the time of colonization is still dominant in the hierarchies that were constructed then are still the way as we look at one another. And that's why the structures of our societies, regardless of where we are, they are still somehow racialized. And the second question say, I believe that every kind of conflict needs to be taken into consideration, and everything should start from a very embodied local perspective. But if we expand the conversation, we'll see that even countries that have never experienced colonization are still suffering some of the consequences and impact of coloniality.
Thanks, Raymundo. We will now turn for the final word from Emma.
Okay, I'll try and believe. Yes, I agree. I think we do need an intersectional approach to all of this. And if your, major ethical issue is the conflict between different ethnic groups, then you need to deal with, you need to respond to that, and you need to tell the world that that's what you're doing. I think that's the thing. This is what concerns me about the debates that we have. We have to understand that they are diverse in themselves. And I think another issue for my own context is, how do we engage the kind of people who are trolling Eve on Twitter? What language? Because actually, we've got to think about the language that enables us to have this conversation, but also language that takes people with us and makes and class, has kind of dropped off the agenda. But a lot of the issues in our society are around class and around the way in which the elites and people in a not the poorest people in our country, but those who have had economic disadvantage over many years, have a kind of an ideological alliance. How do we respond to that? So I think thinking about this in an intersectional way is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we will just end up speaking to ourselves and we will make no difference. So that's one of my concerns. I think to respond to the issue of resource, I'm sorry to hear that, but it goes right through what we're trying to say. It goes right through the system. So, for example, there's an awful lot of theology that has come from the global south. It's available, not as much as it should be, but it is. I'm a historian. We don't have enough church historians from the global south. I'm constantly relying on people like me who've written about it. And that's because church history is not being taught. Now, maybe there are some colonial reasons why that is so, that people feel it's not applicable, it's too colonially infringed and so forth. But there is a concern in which the past is, in my view, being misrepresented, because people spend a paragraph of whatever they're going to write in their theology about the past and then move on, and they misrepresent what actually happened in the past. And so I think for me that's a grave concern, and it comes into my teaching when I'm looking for resources. Where are the global south historians that I can use when they haven't got the courses, they're not being taught and so forth. So there's a real problem of resource that goes through curriculum as well as goes through opportunities, access to education and all these things. So we need to keep working at it as much as possible on many, many levels. I hope that was quick enough, Peniel.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Emma, Eve, and Raymundo for a rich session. I'm really grateful to you for the way in which you have helped us to delve into certain critical issues at the heart of the study of world Christianity. And let me end with a note from the New Delhi report, which may be useful for us today. It said, the achievement of unity will involve nothing less than the death and rebirth of many forms of church life as we have known them. We believe that nothing less costly can finally suffice. And I think this session has in many ways invited us to this death to the self and to reawakening to new forms of life. And I thank you very much. But before I end, Albin will put us a slide about the next short paper sessions that are going to take place in about 25 minutes from now. And let me also use this opportunity to thank all of you, especially the participants, for being part of this rich conference, and also to the presenters for leading us through these complex themes. Our next parallel session, short paper sessions, will start at 17 hours, 5 o'clock. So please feel free to enjoy the richness that these sessions will open for us as well. Thank you all very much.